Okay, we're good to go.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I want to acknowledge that somebody else from my team is on the call. I told her I wouldn't make her talk, but Suzanne Marchak is a dedicated member of the Burrowing Owl team as well. So I wanted to recognize her being here. So tonight I'm going to talk about what our team does research and conservation wise with burrowing owls in San Diego and broader Southern California. Gotta make that work. There we go. So here's just a kind of a quick overview of what we're going to cover. I'm going to talk a little bit about the species themselves and some just kind of life history, issues, threats, things like that. And then I'll talk about our program and give a pretty broad overview, and then talk a little bit at the end about kind of some newer irons in the fire that we have. So regarding the biology and status of the species, as I'm sure many of you know, they're a small owl species. They have the distinction of being active during the day and the night. So they are a very visible species of owl, unlike many other very more secretive owls. There are between 15 and 25 subspecies across their range, which is the Western Hemisphere. And ongoing genetic studies are trying to kind of untangle some of those questions about systematics. And I'll touch on that a little bit in the next slide. There are two recognized subspecies here in the US, the Western subspecies, which is what I'll be talking about today, and the Florida subspecies. And they are a species that doesn't exhibit sexual dimorphism and as far as size, like a lot of other raptors do, but the males tend to fade during the breeding season because they spend a lot more time outside of the burrow. So oftentimes when you see a pair later into the season, the male will look a lot lighter, but that is not always true. Sometimes the female fades very quickly after incubation. So I mentioned the two different subspecies. You can see the range of the two subspecies, the Western subspecies on the left and the Florida subspecies on the right. The Western subspecies has two different kind of phenotypes as far as where they spend their time. So we have birds that are migratory and birds that are resident, and the residents tend to be in the southern and western part of the range. That includes San Diego County, and the migrants tend to be in the northern and eastern parts of the range. And then I mentioned before a little bit about genetics. There is ongoing research, which we've contributed some samples to, that has shown that there's limited gene flow among the different resident populations between both the resident to resident populations and between resident and migrant populations. But the migratory populations are what we call panmictic, or their genetics are kind of all mixed up. So you could take a blood sample from a burrowing owl and you could tell that it's from San Diego or from Riverside or from the Bay Area, but you couldn't necessarily tell that if it's from Wyoming or Montana or Washington. As far as their conservation status, burrowing owls as a whole are listed as an IUCN CITES 2 species, which gives them some level of protection globally. The Western subspecies has various levels of protection in North America, and the Florida subspecies is considered threatened within the state of Florida. As I mentioned, they're a small owl and they're active day and night. And they nest in underground burrows, or things that are kind of like burrows. And they are semi-colonial, so they like to be around other burrowing owls generally. They're very dependent on fossorial or digging animals. This could include desert tortoise or California ground squirrel here in California, American badgers, different types of prairie dogs, anything that digs burrows big enough for them, they would utilize that, and they are highly reliant on them here in Western North America. The Florida subspecies lives in an area with sandier soil, so they can often dig their own burrows, which gives them a little bit of an advantage when it comes to having burrow sites. Overall they prefer an open grassland habitat, and they are opportunistic feeders, so they'll basically eat anything that they can catch. They're generally not very picky in that regard. And they can exhibit very strong philopetry or site fidelity. So we often see the same owls returning to the same site and sometimes the same burrow multiple years in a row. As far as their kind of nesting and survival, they can produce quite a few eggs. So in the literature, it says between 6 to 12 eggs. We did see one female lay 14 eggs. One year she was not with a male, so they probably weren't fertilized, but the short story is they can lay a lot of eggs. And this is probably some kind of adaptation for boom or bust. So they can, in a good year, they can have a lot of babies, and in a bad year, they may not have as many. Annual survival can also be highly variable from year to year. And this kind of bears out even between the migrants and the non-migrants. So non-migrants tend to have higher survival, but we've been finding over the last several years that the survival of the San Diego population has become more variable and is kind of more toward the lower ends of those ranges for the non-migrants right now, which is a little bit scary, and we're not entirely sure what to make of that. The species longevity record from the bird banding lab in the US, between the US and Canada, is 9 years and 11 months. So they can, well, I should say they're not a very long-lived species. And so that also may add to kind of this boomer bust strategy for nesting, to try to have a good year with a lot of babies, because you may not be around next year to have more. As far as mortality, they face a lot of different issues that can cause mortality from predation, and they do practice infanticide. So when there's not enough food, the parents may actually kill some of their own juveniles to feed them to the other juveniles. They can die from different types of human impacts, like vehicle collisions, destruction of their burrows or crushing of the burrows, or things like pesticides that are just out in the environment. If they happen to catch a mouse that has some pesticide in it, they're a very small bird, so they really can't deal with that very well. One aspect of their biology that I find interesting and quite endearing is that they decorate their burrows during the early part of the breeding season. So here's a variety of different types of burrow decorations. So you'll see on the left, these are a little bit more urban owls. They tend to find a lot of just human junk. And then the birds that are a little bit more out in our more rural sites are using things like dirt clods and coyote scats and other types of scat. So they're using a little bit more natural items for decoration, but this is often an indication that a burrow is being used by the owls. So now turning to some of the issues and threats that they face, one of the biggest issues that we find are issues related to habitat. And so the loss of burrows, or just not having enough burrows, and the extirpation of the animals that dig burrows is a big problem. Across their range, the animals that they rely on have declined. Things like ground squirrels and prairie dogs were often removed from areas. Even up until less than 100 years ago, there was a very strong dislike for squirrels and bounties for killing squirrels and bringing squirrel tails. And so just the loss of burrows overall, because they do require those burrows for nesting, has been a big problem. And one of the ways to try to solve that problem is by using artificial burrows, which has both, it's kind of a double-edged sword. So we have this high reliance on artificial burrows, which are a structure that are built by people and require ongoing maintenance. And so in some cases, if there's not a long-term plan or long-term funding for that maintenance aspect, the burrows can become unusable in a very short period of time. Whereas the natural burrows that squirrels and other animals are digging are kind of much more alive and sustainable through a much longer period of time. Another issue with habitat is just the degradation of our grasslands. Many of the grasslands that are left in California, which is a very small percentage, have been converted into non-native grasses. So you can see in this photograph, the grass in the photograph this is wild oats. It grows very tall and very thick, and this is not amenable to squirrels or owls. And then just in general, the overall loss of habitat and fragmentation of habitat, often due to ongoing development. So this, the GIF shows the over time development occurring at one of our main study sites in Otay Mesa. And you can just see that over time, all this open grassland type habitat has just been graded and filled in. And this is happening across their entire, across their range in California. I think there are other issues outside of California related to their habitat, but this is a major one for us. Another issue that goes somewhat along with that kind of fragmentation of habitat and urbanization is that we have subsidized predators. So there are a lot more ravens and a lot more coyotes and a lot more skunks now that the owls have to contend with, that have really figured out how to take advantage of living alongside us humans. And so they're just in much higher numbers than they would have been, while the burrowing owls are at lower numbers. So the number of owls that are killed by these types of predators in any given year can be really problematic. And then I mentioned rodenticides. We don't really know how much of an issue this is, how much of an issue it is, I should say, for mortality, but it's, almost certain that most of the burrowing owls and many other predator and carnivorous species have some level of pesticide or rodenticides in their bodies. One other issue that we've been learning about and dealing with is our stick-tight fleas. This is a naturalized flea that lives in, across the southern U.S. at least. They came into the U.S. in I want to say the late 1800s, and steadily made their way across the South and into California. So they've been here for a long time. They've been naturalized for a long time, but we have been kind of following outbreaks that have been occurring with the owls and are looking into that, and I'll touch on that a little bit more later. And then I also put the little blurb the little graphic on the bottom about avian flu, highly pathogenic avian influenza. We're having an outbreak currently in really in the world. So far, we haven't seen any impacts to the burrowing owls, and we don't necessarily expect to, because they don't tend to interact with the biggest vector species, but it does play somewhat of a role in some of our work, especially due to our translocation work. As far as different management strategies that are used, I mentioned some of the issues that they're facing. So we've got the loss and reduction and fragmentation of habitat, and then the loss of the animals that dig burrows for them. Another issue is that there can be conflicts with management of threatened and endangered species, because burrowing owls are a lower conservation status than some other species that they often interact with. That can be problematic. So trying to understand better ways to manage a lot of at-risk species in smaller and smaller areas is definitely a piece of what we kind of do now and are probably going to do more of in the future. The good news with the owls is that they are pretty tolerant to some level of disturbance. They're not going to live in downtown San Diego, but they can do fairly well in areas that, have some level of disturbance from humans. What they can actually endure is kind of, still a question because of things like the ravens and coyotes. But they're not this secretive species that won't breed if they're too close to humans or anything like that. And I mentioned the use of artificial burrows, that they will readily use those artificial burrows. There are again some pluses and minuses to that, but they do very readily use that type of conservation intervention. They also have a high reproductive potential. I mentioned the number of eggs that they can lay, and this can work in our favor when we're talking about things like a conservation breeding and release program. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and give an overview of our program. The guiding principle behind our program is to try to work within a more like kind of a holistic approach, I guess I would say, with squirrels being really at the center of that. And so whenever we talk about burrowing owls, we talk about squirrels. They're a really important factor in conserving burrowing owls. So there are a lot of words on this page. I'm going to switch to a timeline that will make it a little bit easier, but I wanted to put this here just to kind of show the breadth of the different activities that we have been undertaking since 2011 when the program started. So here's a little bit of a timeline to give you hopefully a better visual representation. So early on, we actually started out with trying to understand protocols and best practices for translocating ground squirrels. As I just mentioned, our ground squirrels are a really important aspect of burrowing owl habitat and burrowing owl conservation. And so we took that on first, and then we moved into doing population monitoring, trying to understand what the local population is actually doing, understanding some of the pluses and minuses of those use of artificial burrows. And then we moved into even kind of more hands-on interventions with translocation, conservation breeding. And so I'll talk about each of these things, a little bit more or less. There's a lot to talk about. So the ground squirrels are really important. As you could see in that graphic, they're kind of the linchpin in the whole system, and they are what we call an ecosystem engineer. So they change the environment around them, and they change it in a way that allows other animals to make use of it. And you can see here, this picture is kind of funny because this is an artificial burrow, but the squirrels have been doing the work around the artificial burrow. So having squirrels in the system is really important. And we wanted to understand, how can we get more squirrels into an area where they've been extirpated or they are in very low numbers because of those past interventions of people trying to get rid of them. And so back in 2011, when we first started our program, we started out trying to understand squirrel translocation, and we did this in an experimental framework. So we had paired plots that in each case, one plot in the pair had squirrels translocated, and the other plot did not have squirrels translocated. And we did this because we wanted to understand, is it the treatments that we're making to the vegetation that are causing the squirrels that could bring squirrels in, or do we actually have to physically put squirrels into the system to get them, to encourage them to do the job of digging burrows? And so we had these paired plots, and then within each plot, you can kind of see here, it looks like a pie or a Pac-Man. We had two wedges that one had mowing. So this wedge would have been mowed. This wedge was mowed and had starter holes augered in it. And then this wedge was our control wedge that had no, no vegetation treatments at all. And so we translocated squirrels from a couple of different areas that had a lot of squirrels that they were willing to give up. And we put radio collars on the squirrels to track them. And then we also used retrapping after release to see who was still around. So some of the squirrels had radio collars and some of them just had ear tags, which I don't know if, it doesn't look like you can see one in there. But they're just little individually numbered tags that go kind of like earrings in their ears. And so from all of the post-release monitoring that we did after translocation, we did find that the squirrels were doing the job they were supposed to do. They were creating these really beautiful burrows. And we did find that we needed to bring the squirrels in. So this graph shows on the right side where with the gray bars, these were the numbers from plots where squirrels were translocated. And in the black bars are plots where squirrels were not translocated. And these black bars actually represent some of these squirrels moving to these plots. So we did not find that just reducing the vegetation in proximity to wild squirrel populations actually caused them to come into our plots that we really did need to translocate the squirrels, which is a very labor intensive and a very long process. It's not an easy process, and I don't think I mentioned it later. So we also did look at if we used that vegetation management and cover piles and kind of made had a much bigger area that was mowed, and then kind of made a ladder of these cover piles, could we get the squirrels to move on their own? And we did find that that was also effective. It just, again, it took a lot longer to get the squirrels into numbers that would be making enough burrows for the owls. And so there's really no silver bullet when it comes to trying to get this ecosystem back intact. It is a big investment and a long time commitment to do this. So switching again, because I think on the last time that I gave this talk, I went way over, so I cut a lot of stuff out. So we're going to switch now and from squirrels and talk about the work we've done with owls. And so this list just shows some of the different techniques and types of studies that we've done, including a long-term banding program. I mentioned translocation and conservation breeding, and we'll talk a little bit more about our use of cameras, and then a little experiment that we did with burrow microclimate and designs for artificial burrows. So I mentioned the banding. If you guys happen to be out and about in San Diego and you see any burrowing owls with colored leg bands on their legs, we would love to hear about it. These are what the leg bands look like. Most of our birds have green bands like this. But especially if you're up birding in Ramona, you may see birds with blue bands as well. Trying to think of anything else. Yeah, so if you're out and about, my email is at the end of the presentation. So if you happen to see banded birds, please let us know. So the banding in combination with using remote cameras, so these are trail cameras or game cameras that we set up at the burrow entrances to monitor productivity and survival. We're able to, with the bands are each uniquely numbered, so they're kind of like the bird's name, and we can actually read those bands on camera. And so we can understand survival within the breeding season and from year to year from reciting those bands. And we can also understand things like reproductive rates, whether or not nests are successful. We've looked at prey provisioning. We get some insights into different types of predation that are occurring at the burrows. We're mostly monitoring active breeding burrows, but that the number of burrows we monitor has increased greatly over the years because of our translocation work, and we do monitor burrows where we've translocated owls to understand outcomes. And we have 3 main sites in San Diego County: Otay Mesa, which I showed you that graphic of the development before, Rancho Jamul, and Ramona. So I talked a little bit about artificial burrows. One thing that we wanted to understand, it seemed like there may have been some differences in productivity early on when we first started monitoring nest burrows. That it seemed like there were some differences in productivity between natural and artificial burrows, and so we wanted to better understand that. And one of the hypotheses was that the conditions inside the burrows may be part of the story. And so we used these little microclimate data loggers. You can barely see it inside this wiffle ball. They look like just a giant watch battery, but they do measure temperature and relative humidity. You can set them up to take those measurements at whatever interval you want to. And we had this kind of natural experiment set up for us, kind of, I wouldn't say by accident, but we were fortunate that we could take advantage of it, where one of our sites in Otay Mesa had an equal number of artificial burrows that were made out of wood. So they looked like this. They're much more angular. And half of them were made out of plastic. So they look like this. But in both cases, they had one chamber that had 2 tunnels leading into the chamber. And then we had a site right next door that only has natural burrows. And so we were able to put these data loggers inside each of the burrows, and then we paired that with an eye button on the outside. You can see here on this little post, and measured basically the buffering capabilities of the different types of burrows. And I will say, putting anything into a natural burrow is incredibly difficult. So this is kind of, even given that we probably didn't get to the chambers where the owls would have been nesting with the eye buttons, we still had significant results from this study, and found that the natural burrows were much better at buffering the outside conditions than these particular types of artificial burrows. So then the next question was, could we change the design of the artificial burrows to make them better mimic the natural burrows? And so we wanted to look at that standard design that I just showed you on the last slide. We thought about, if we make these, because those are pretty simple, if we make them more complex, so if we make the tunnels much longer and a lot curvier to try to mimic how complex squirrel burrows are, would that change things? And then we wanted to look at this Y design where we still had 2 entrances at the surface, which gives the owls more places to escape to from predators, but actually comes into, in this case, it was a T. We actually modified that later. And then just had 1 tunnel going into the burrow chamber. And would that change things? And we did find that the Y design did a much better job of buffering against outside conditions, and was much closer. The conditions were much closer to the natural burrows. Another thing that we found was that I mentioned that half of the burrows were wood and half of the burrows were plastic in that last, on this previous slide. So this was in Otay Mesa, and this was in Rancho Hamul. The wooden burrows in Otay Mesa that we measured also were comparatively better than the plastic burrows. And so after both of these experiments combined, we arrived at a design using a wooden box. We maintained the plastic tubes because they are much easier to maintain and to clean out, to make sure that the burrows continue to function the way that they're supposed to. And we modified this T into an actual Y, which makes it a lot easier. So it forks a little bit differently, and it makes it a lot easier, again, to run a burrowscope through to make sure that the tubes are clear. So switching gears a little bit again, we also did some work to try to understand habitat suitability initially in San Diego County, and then we expanded that to Southern California. And so this was taking historic data of known burrowing owl locations, and then comparing them to different features, different habitat features that had been mapped at around the same time as those occurrences of the owls, to get a better idea of, you can see on this map, there are lots of little pixels. And so within any given pixel, we're basically measuring how similar is this pixel to the pixels that would have had owls in them, to understand what areas have the highest suitability of the mapped conditions that we have for owls, and to help guide us into better understanding areas that would support owls, and to kind of guide some of our more recent work. So this work happened about 8 years ago. And then we used this information to help us. This was one aspect to help us rank different sites, different potential sites for expansion of the population. As part of that work, we did on the ground assessment. So the first step was to use that GIS approach, so remote sense data, things that are being measured from space on a computer, and then actually ground truth that with these on the ground measurements, and then ranked the different areas to help identify which areas could support owls, and then also to help us assess potential management needs or things that could be done to improve sites either to make them potential sites or just even if they were good sites already, things that would just continue to help make them better for owls. And so we went through a whole site selection process based on the habitat data and then other criteria like looking at predation pressure, the kind of status of the site, how well conserved is it, things like that. And with that type of information, we were, able to come to the conclusion that Rancho Humul and the Ramona Grasslands were both really good candidates for having owls translocated to them. And so starting in 2018, we translocated owls first to Rancho Humul, and then starting in 2021 to the Ramona Grasslands. And so the goal behind this is to try to spread out the risk of loss of the species from the county, because right now they really only occur on their own for breeding for the most part in Otay Mesa. And so we wanted to expand the population and make sure that there were other breeding nodes that could sustain the species if something catastrophic happens in Otay, which is an area that's undergoing a lot of development right now. And so with our translocations, we use a soft release method, and we translocate both birds that are impacted by development. So if the wildlife agencies decide that a particular group of owls should be moved, then we become involved in that way. Or we also have had a small conservation breeding program and have produced owls for release through that. And so usually the birds are acclimated in these temporary aviaries for between 2 and 4 weeks. Some of the owls are tracked using GPS transmitters. A piece of a study that I haven't even touched on here, but it would be a much longer story. But we did find that using conspecific cues, so basically acoustic calls or fake whitewash in the form of white latex paint spread at the burrow entrances, led to the translocated owls being 20 times more likely to stay at the release site. And so if we move owls to a site that does not already have burrowing owls, then we use these field stereo systems to broadcast calls, the territorial calls that the owls would make, to kind of mimic them moving into a neighborhood that is already occupied. Because they're semi-colonial, they can kind of get cues from those acoustics and those visual cues that it's a good place to stay. And then we couple that with using supplemental feeding to really reduce the stress of the movement of the owls. So for the first breeding season, they get a lot of support from us to make sure that they stay in the location we want them to stay in and that they have the best chance possible to survive and to reproduce. Oh, I think there are some animations here that I forgot to. So this is a map of what those GPS locations look like from the birds that have transmitters on them. And then I also mentioned our conservation breeding program. So we have worked with the Living Coast Discovery Center to breed up to 3 pairs of owls in any given year. We actually paused the program last fall because of the highly pathogenic avian influenza outbreak. So we don't currently have any owls in breeding right now. We're not sure when we're going to ramp it back up, but we were concerned about some potential limitations because of the avian flu outbreak. And so for right now, that's what we're doing. But we have moved I think it's over 100 owls now, to try to help build up the Rancho Humul and the Ramona populations. We do still have one owl at the safari park at Condor Ridge. That's part of the one male owl that's part of the program. There's one female owl that's part of the program at Living Coast Discovery Center that are kind of our backup just in case of anything catastrophic. But ultimately, these are all owls that the wildlife agencies ask us to bring in for a period of time. And so they contribute to the breeding program, and then they're all released back to the wild at some point. So these guys the two that we currently have will will get released probably this next year. And then we also rescued 3 chicks this year because it was a pretty rough year for the owls. And so so we had situations where we were able to intervene and remove chicks from nests that were where one parent disappeared. So they were basically guaranteed to fail. And so those birds will also be released this spring into those either Hamul or Ramona to help build those populations. I've covered a lot of stuff, and because we've been working with the species for such a long time, we have a lot of resources that we freely share, because the whole point of our program is not to hoard information, but to try to do our part to conserve the species and help others. So we serve as, I guess, experts to others, to consultants, to the wildlife agencies as needed, and provide, all of our information to anybody that would like it. So a couple newer, I guess, irons in the fire. I mentioned briefly the fleas early on. We don't really understand. We know that the flea species were naturalized quite a long time ago, so it's not a new problem. But from kind of anecdotal information, it seems like they're becoming more of a problem than they were in the past. We've heard other burrowing owl researchers that have done work over the course of the last 40 to 50 years, that they remembered occasionally being covered with fleas after they had banded owls, but it seems like it may be a problem that is increasing. What we are not sure of is how climate change may affect this as an issue. It seems anecdotally like the fleas we tend to see outbreaks after warm, dry winters. And given that we're seeing these changing weather patterns, we don't know what that might mean in terms of the fleas. We have figured out ways to intervene in the field when we see this happening. So it's hard to tell, but on the photos from the remote cameras, you can kind of see like this bird just kind of looks squinty, but those are actually fleas that this type of flea, they do jump, but once they attach themselves to the skin, and once they attach, they don't move. They're kind of like ticks, and they just like latch on and they suck blood, and they lay eggs straight from while they're latched on to the bird. And then the eggs fall into the soil, and then the life cycle continues. And the females tend to be much more affected because they're inside the burrow for a long period of time during incubation. And so sometimes we can detect this on the cameras. It's often too late when we detect it on the cameras. So it's something that we're trying to understand how to surveil better, so that we can intervene earlier. And you can see here that this female is also has fleas on her eyes. And so we've figured out that in the field, we can capture these birds and just do topical treatments of ophthalmic ointment, which actually smothers the fleas. And then we treat the soil itself inside the burrows with diatomaceous earth to kill the fleas that are there. And so trying to do these kind of low impact types of interventions to try to ward this off as a big problem is kind of where we're at right now. We did find that after this outbreak in 2018, that there were 6 females that were highly impacted, and none of those 6 females, or one or none of those 6 females, I don't remember now off the top of my head, did not return the following year, whereas we had, I think, over 70% of the non-impacted females returned. We don't know if the females died or if they just decided that was not a good nesting site, and so they did not return. But we just don't quite understand what this threat may do for an already small and declining population. So that's one newer avenue of research that we're looking at, and we have had a couple interns look at the couple interns help us to look at this. And so we're just kind of slowly building up our knowledge. We've taken soil samples, we've taken samples using these little felt square swabs from inside the burrows, just to try to better understand when the fleas are there, how bad they are, things like that. It's just, we just don't know a lot about this. They're well documented with chickens, but they're easy to treat with, added chickens that are under human care. So trying to deal with this with wild birds is a little bit more of an issue. Another problem that we've had, all these photos were taken this year. This is one of our field staff. This berm is usually completely bare, and this year the growth was over her head. This was a small lake that was at the entrance of one of our sites. This is showing how matted the grasses were at another one of our sites. This was a major problem this year because of the timing and the amount of rain that we got. We had this excessive vegetation growth, and we did see pretty much lower survival and productivity at some of these sites. And we think that it's because the owls, they can't hunt in vegetation like this or like this. They just can't get to the food when the vegetation is so high and thick. And so this was a major challenge for this year. And we've already been working with a lot of our partners to try to enhance how vegetation management is done and to do it in a more coordinated way. We're also working with newer partners to set up a collaboration or really piggyback onto a collaboration that's already occurring at Rancho Jamul, which is where this picture was taken. They've been using cattle grazing for many years to help maintain the vegetation. And there are researchers out of UC Berkeley that have been doing really formalized measurements and studies on the impacts of the grazing there. And so we are hoping that we're going to start working with them at our other sites to see how grazing might be used as a tool for vegetation management in different areas. And then lastly, one of our kind of really, really fresh new thoughts and ideas that we don't even have really fully fleshed out yet is to try to resurvey some areas of the state that were surveyed about 15 years ago. One of the big conservation issues for this species is just that there's a lack of data from a lot of areas. We study the population in San Diego County very intensively, so we know a lot about what the owls here are doing. But the owls in the Imperial Valley, for instance, there are a lot of burrowing owls there, and there hasn't been very recent surveys there to really understand how, if the population is decreasing, how quickly it may be decreasing, things like that. And so we're looking into using these passive acoustic recorders. So you can see one in a case here set up by a camera trap. But there are these really neat little autonomous units that record audio, and then using artificial intelligence and other technologies, computer-based technologies, to then run all the data through the computer and get, you can look for the signatures, the vocal signatures of the owls, and better and understand if they're there or not. So this, again, like I said, is a very fresh new idea, but we're pretty excited about the prospects for that as a less labor intensive and less invasive way to try to monitor for owls across a very large area. So I mentioned Suzanne, she's right here at the outset. I'm just representing our team. We have this is our team. We have an amazing team that is incredibly dedicated, and we have many, many volunteers that have helped us over the years, that continue to help us. And of course, we can't do it without our collaborators and funders. So I also want to recognize all of the different groups that have contributed over the years, both financially and in their time and their expertise. And lastly, people often ask what they can do. We do have a citizen science project on Zooniverse called Wild Watch Burrowing Owl. This is an online platform for Zooniverse is just an online citizen science platform. Our Wild Watch Burrowing Owl is a project that allows people to help go through the millions of photos that we collect every year and help us identify what's in them. So with that, I will thank you for your time, and we'll take any questions that you might have. I'll leave that up for a second too, if anybody wants to write down my email address.
That was great, Colleen. Thank you so much. My cat was so excited about the presentation. She's sitting on my lap watching the screen, which she never does that. She's not a lap cat, so.
I'm actually shocked my cat hasn't made an appearance yet, but it kind of sounds like she might be preparing to make one, but at least she didn't interrupt.
So we have a couple of questions. One was with the stick-type fleas, are they mainly around the owl's eyes?
They latch on to the bare skin, mostly on the head. So they're often around the eyes and on the eyelids, and then in that pocket that is under the keratinized part of the beak. So there's like these little pockets right up in there. And so, yeah, so they'll latch on there and around the eyes. And they can do, they can take a lot of blood. That in that outbreak that we had in 2018, we actually brought, before we really understood what to do about it, we did bring 2 families of owls into the veterinary hospital at the safari park, and because the 2 females were in really bad condition when we were capturing them for banding, because at that time we didn't know that they had fleas until we had them in hand, and the 2 they were incredibly anemic. One was down there, a normal hematocrit reading for them is somewhere around 50, and they were down to 24 and 14% respectively. So they were pretty anemic and not in good shape. And so that's one of the bonuses for us of working in an institution that has such great veterinary capacity, is that we can collaborate internally in our organization with our veterinary staff. And so they were totally game for us to bring these birds in and then to try to figure out what we could do both with them in hand and then what we could do for the other birds that were still out in the wild. And we did find that doing these field treatments was much more was much less stressful for the birds, because they can stay in their home burrows, and was pretty effective for getting rid of the fleas and ensuring that they could successfully continue to breed. Because we often see that those nests fail, and then the females may or may not return the following year.
Okay. And we had another question about the burrows. If an owl has a natural burrow and it is damaged, are they able to do any kind of repair, or do they have to move out and go to a new burrow?
I think it depends. It depends on how it's damaged, and probably kind of where they are in the season as well. If it's early in the breeding season, they're probably just going to leave and try to find something better. If it's later in the breeding season or outside of the breeding season, they may still be able to use it for some kind of protection. The other big issue is if a burrow is squished, they may be trapped inside and not be able to get out of it. So that's really the really big threat in terms of burrows being damaged.
Yeah. And we have a comment. There are a lot of owls out by Westmoreland and Sunny Bono National Wildlife Refuge.
There are, that is true. We the study that I didn't talk about, we did a larger regional study a handful of years ago that took us out to the Imperial Valley and Sunny Bono and the Coachella Valley and Western Riverside County. So we covered a lot of ground, and we're definitely going to be probably visiting those places again to try to, especially across the Imperial Valley, to try to understand what that how that population is doing, because there was a pretty detailed survey that was done again about 15 years ago, but there's not really great recent information on how the population as a whole is doing. And that area contains something like, up to 70% of the population in California. So that's a really important population. So we really do want to better understand that, and that will in turn, we share all of the information that we gather, all of our research results with the state and the federal agencies, and to help them make decisions when they have to make decisions about how to protect species better.
Mm-hmm. And Allison mentions something we were talking about earlier, that she had seen a burrowing owl next to the railway line at San Elijo, and how is the population changing?
Yeah, it's pretty well understood that the population is declining. We had a symposium actually earlier this year where we invited speakers from really across the range, but mostly from California, to talk about their most recent research, and from really all the different parts of California that people came to talk about. So the Bay Area, the Central Valley, Western Riverside County, us, the Imperial Valley. It just seems like the numbers are going down across the board. And we just heard a lot of stories about, there used to be so many owls in this place when I was a kid, and now they've just blinked out. And so trying to get a better handle on that. At some point, whether or not another petition to list would be appropriate, but we would need to gather more data before the agencies need data to make those kinds of determinations. And so that's definitely one of our motivations for trying to better understand what's happening.
Right. Another question, could decorating the burrow entrance with things like coyote poop help to dissuade predators?
That's a great question. There are a couple of different competing theories about the burrow decoration behavior. One of them is whether or not it kind of masks their scent and does protect them from predators. Another idea is that it may help them to farm insects for their juveniles. Based on the timing of when they're decorating it, I think the leading theory is that it's mostly to indicate to other owls that the burrow is occupied, but we see really different levels of decoration. Some of the males are the ones that are doing the decoration, so they bring in all these bits and pieces, and some of them are very prolific decorators, and they find all kinds of junk and have very, very obvious that it's very obvious that owls are using that burrow, and others are very subtle or just don't decorate at all. So it's still, I think, an open question, but there are different ideas about why they might do it. And it could be a combination of those things too.
Right. How far do they migrate? And Jeannie writes that her husband is a seagoing person and once sent her a picture of a burrowing owl taken on the ship in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah, I have heard of this. I think sometimes they are hanging out on the ship and then the ship leaves and they go with it. There was this story about, oh gosh, it was like probably 10 or 12 years ago now, about the aircraft carrier, the Carl S. Vinson, that they had a burrowing owl on the deck of the aircraft carrier out at sea. And the thought is that it probably just hitched a ride from shore. But I have, definitely seen videos online of like birds that got blown off course and they just happened to find a boat out in the ocean, and then they tag along on the boat and make it back to shore safely. So that could definitely be happening too. As far as how far they migrate, they can go, I mean, they range up to southern Canada, and some of the Canadian birds migrate down into the west coast of Mexico. So they can migrate thousands of miles. So yeah.
Do you have an estimate of how many naturally occurring owls are in the county?
That's a great question. It's always a really hard one to answer because we don't know which owls we're not counting. And so it's always that's always hard to give a hard number, but it's probably in the low hundreds is I guess the as exact as I could get. And we do have an influx of owls during the non-breeding season. So we have birds that come here to spend the winter and then leave. So it also depends on what time of year you're looking, but that's even harder to estimate how many migrants come for the winter. But we monitor about 50 pairs every year, and we think that we're covering maybe half or a little bit less of the population.
Okay. We're back to the fleas. How do you treat them, and is it possible to give them some sort of a systemic treatment like we do to dogs and cats?
Yeah, when we first had that outbreak in 2018 and we're trying to figure out what to do, we did, because we had the veterinarians and they could help with that we did take oral antiparasitics for them, and it's really challenging because we have to basically get the medication from the vets that day and then go and administer it at that same time, and that can be really difficult. And so we actually did find that treating the burrows was it gave us the most bang for our buck. It's pretty easy to do. The materials are really cheap. I mean, diatomaceous earth does not cost a lot. We sometimes use Delta dust, which is also a chemical I'm losing the words, but anyway, but we try to use just the diatomaceous earth when we can because that's a more natural substance. We do have to be careful regardless whether it's diatomaceous earth or the Delta dust. If there are sensitive invertebrates in the area, like we have a lot of butterfly species that aren't doing very well. We have some sites that have fairy shrimp at them. Just trying to not do damage to other species in the quest to help the species that we're working with. So we have to be really careful about how we administer that treatment. We generally just do that inside the burrows where it's not going to get out into the broader environment very easily. And then the topical ointment is really, really effective. We have had several times where we've captured birds, put the ointment on, and then didn't capture everybody in the family, so had to go back the following week. And when we get them in hand, all of the fleas are gone. Or if they're around, they're dead, they're shriveled up, and the owls are healing. So it kind of has a double benefit where it smothers the fleas, but it's also an antibiotic ointment, so it helps their skin heal as well.
That's good. Jeannie writes that so the bird didn't hitch a ride, it found the ship.
Yeah, that's incredible. I always think those guys are so lucky when they're they should play the lottery that day because they managed to find a boat or a ship out in the middle of the ocean.
I know. I think I've got all the questions in the chat. Does anybody else have a question? And if so, go ahead and unmute yourself and feel free to ask.
I think you asked the question already, or it came up, but do the owls occupy those burrows year round?
That's a good question.
Migrating, obviously, but
yeah, no, that's a really good question. They're the birds that breed in San Diego, we think that they stay year round. We have seen some of the birds, because we do check the burrows basically year round. Some of the birds stay at the exact same burrow for the entire year. Other birds will leave for a short period of time, a couple months maybe, and then they'll come back sometimes to the exact same burrow. So it's kind of a mixed bag, and we're not really sure why some birds stay at a place all year and some birds go somewhere else. And then of course we've got the migrants that come in for the winter and then leave for their breeding season. to go back north.
Yeah, thanks.
We got another flea question.
Oh yeah.
Gee, I think a lot of us had flea issues this year, didn't we, with all the wet weather? We're really focusing on the fleas. If diatomaceous earth helps, couldn't it just be sprinkled in and around the burrows when they're first made, or perhaps have a dust bath sort of area that birds might use that has the DE in it?
Yeah, you would think that that would be the easiest thing to do. Unfortunately, it loses its effectiveness when it gets humid or gets too wet. So we do have to retreat, and that is one of the questions that we have, that we're trying to better understand the timing of when the fleas are doing the very, going through the various parts of their life cycle, and when might be the best times to treat. Right now, it's a lot of kind of, we're reacting to what we see and then doing treatments. It would be great to get to a point of just saying we should treat every burrow in May or whatever it is, and that would be the way to go. But we don't really know the answer to that yet, and obviously it's going to change from year to year depending on how much rain we get. So strangely enough, I know when it's wet, pets tend to get fleas more. The wet weather actually is for the stick-type fleas and the burrowing owls. The wet weather actually seems to reduce the chances of them getting outbreaks. We don't tend to see the fleas in wet years, and that was no exception this year. We saw very few fleas on the owls or in the burrows this year.
That's good. I think that looks like the chat's empty at the moment. Anybody else have a question? Well, looks like we got everybody. So I know we're a little bit over our time. So thank you, Colleen, for such a great program. And we are recording this, so we will be posting it on our website and YouTube, and Bob will be sending it around to everyone as well, in case others that may have missed it or are interested in this program. So thanks again for coming. We had a great time.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, everyone.
Take care. Good night, everybody.
Good night.